Hey there, ceramic students. Welcome back to the studio. In this tutorial, we're going to begin our next unit, and we're going to talk a little bit about building with clay. Not like the previous projects where we were kind of working with our hands and doing a lot of mushing, molding, and kind of squeezing, but working with clay more like maybe a construction material that you're kind of familiar with. Sheet materials are a much more common building material. I think these days, if you've done any kind of construction work at all, you're familiar with basic plywoods or say cabinetry with like birchwood ply. These big sheets of materials that come in standard sizes. You cut them down to whatever size you need and kind of fit them together. In that sense, there's not a whole lot of carving, not a whole lot of shaping going on. It's really more like fitting planes together. Now we can actually treat clay in a similar way. What we'll have to do is roll out a thin sheet of it and then cut it into the pieces that we need. So for this project, we're going to work with the mat board that's in your art kit and cut a 3x3 inch square as our template, kind of like our cookie cutter template. And then after rolling out a thin sheet of clay, we'll cut out 6 squares and assemble them together into a cube using some basic joinery. This mat board is a thick enough material that let's use, let's not use a scissors, let's use an X-Acto blade. Be careful with these blades. The ones that I've given you in your kits behave very much like a pencil, right? If you can draw a straight line with a ruler, you can cut a straight line with a ruler. The blades that come in your X-Actos, they're mounted in the top here, right? They're these kind of disposable, or I should say maybe consumable blade, so you just kind of replace it every time it goes dull. And they have a bevel on one edge of it. You know it's the sharp edge because it has that shiny bevel. As it catches the light, you should see sort of a difference. Now the back edge of the blade is not sharpened, but it's probably still sharp enough to hurt you. So as you're using this knife, you need to give it a bit of respect. A 1-inch blade doesn't seem like it could do too much damage right off the bat, but because of the way we're going to be kind of cutting with your fingers fair enough, close enough to the blade, and also drawing cuts back towards yourself, 1 inch worth of blade can do a fair amount of damage. Common injuries here would be, just like kind of nipping the tip of a finger that's kind of staying, getting a little bit too close to the cut path. So, keeping a Band-Aid close by is not a bad idea. What I'm also going to use to make this project a little bit safer for myself is I'm going to use a steel ruler that I happen to have laying around. If you guys have any straight edge at all, that would be really handy. If worst case scenario, if you just need to use your canvas board, because that's the only straight edge you have, just be careful and know that your blade is going to be sort of spaced out about 1/8 of an inch or so away from the edge, just because of the difference in thickness here. Now, whenever you're cutting with an X-Acto blade too, it's not a bad idea to know what you're cutting into. So I'm cutting through my cardboard and into something else. If that something else happens to be your desk, well, you're going to make somebody pretty angry at home because your desk will be all sliced up. If the blade mounted in these X-Actos is sharp enough to cut, through 8-ply or 4-ply or 8-ply cardstock, it's definitely sharp enough to slice up the desk that you're sitting at, or maybe the countertop you're sitting at. It's definitely sharp enough to cut you. So it's not a bad idea to have something right underneath there. Worst case scenario, again, just flip your canvas board over and you can cut directly into the back of your canvas board. The back is just that straight plywood, and getting a few cut marks in there is not a big deal. Do not cut on the canvas side. You'll just sort of slice through the canvas really easily. You'll rip into the drywall kind of substrate underneath there, and it'll just start kind of pumping dust out into the room. For this demonstration, I'm going to use a cutting mat. I happen to have it in my studio. We use them in our design classes all the time, so I just sort of have it around. Before I get going too far here, what I want to do is measure out a 3x3 inch square on the side. What I can do with this cutting mat, since it's arranged in 1/2-inch increments, is I can just kind of count out 1, 2, 3 inches on the side, and 1, 2, 3 inches on the side. I really like these cutting mats for that reason. also really like them because if I line up my stock with the cutting lines that are on either side, I don't have to do too much precise measuring along the way. If you don't have the ability, if you don't have a cutting board like this to work with, find some sort of measuring tool. A ruler is a really great idea. I'm just going to triple check my measurements here before I start cutting, and just kind of measure to make sure that you're going 3 inches on one side and 3 inches on the other side. Ooh, goodness gracious, this is why you check your measurements, people. I was off by 1/2 inch. Good thing I checked it before I cut. What I will do then, as I'm cutting this, is because it's sort of a thick material, is that I'm not going to cut in one fell swoop. I'm not going to try to make this cut in one slice. Instead, I am going to make multiple passes at that same edge. So imagine, because this piece of cardstock is about 4 ply, some of you guys have 8 ply, and if you cut 1 ply with 1 pass, make the number of passes that you need in order to cut 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers, 4 layers, and eventually you'll slice through it. Keep in mind too that because you cut this with a very sharp blade, you may have a wicked sharp edge on your board here. Because you cut it with a sharp edge, it actually will give you occasionally an edge that's as sharp as the blade itself, especially if you get it at the right angle. So you get some wicked paper cuts from this sort of thing. So just for my personal reference, anytime I make a template like this, I always like to sort of give myself a little cheat sheet of the measurements or the dimensions so that I know that this is a 3 by 3 inch piece. This is going to help me understand what sort of dimensions my final piece will be. Now, as I start to make plans for rolling out the slab, I want to get a sense up front of how big of a slab I'm going to need. If we're going to take our 3 by 3 inch template and kind of make multiples of it and fold it up, or I should say assemble it, I need to consider how many sides are on a cube. If you've never thought this through, right? Well, think 1, 2, 3, 4 for all of the sides. We're going to need a top and we're going to need a bottom. That's 5, 6. So we're going to need 6 3 by 3 inch squares. Now the blocks, the canvas boards that we've made in class are about 7 inches across. That would give you, more than enough 3 by 3 on either side, so you can probably roll a slab that's just slightly inside of the edges as long as your slab is 6 inches across. And the canvas boards are about 12 inches long. Now that's going to give you 1, 2, 3, at least 3 full lengths here. If you really roll it right up to the edge, you might even get 4 3-inch pieces, but we don't need 4. We actually just need 3 on the top row and 3 on the bottom, as long as you don't mess up any pieces with your slab. Enough to get 6 3 by 3 inch pieces is about a 6 by 9 inch slab. That's in from the edges of your slab just a little bit. The thickness of your slab is really going to be dependent on a couple things. I would say it's not a bad idea to shoot for roughly the thickness of a pencil, and we'll talk about why I'm going to use a pencil as an example here, but that really depends on how much clay you have left. At the beginning of the semester, I put enough clay in your hands to kind of get a few projects going. Some of you may be running pretty low, so I want to make sure that as you're working, you roll your clay out thin enough to get that 6 by 9 inch slab. And so we've got to kind of use whatever we've got in our hands. Some of you may be able to roll out thicker slabs. Some of you may have to roll them out fairly thin. Before I get sort of wedging here with this clay, we'll talk about the clay itself. It's to roll out a thin sheet of clay. We should be working with a piece of clay that's reasonably wet and reasonably well wedged. A couple of tools that you're going to find really handy for this is we need some sort of device to roll this out. Now, I'm not sure who runs the kitchen at your house, but the person who runs my kitchen would freak if I grabbed the rolling pin for rolling out cookie doughs or pizza crusts, whatever. So don't do that. Don't go grab the rolling pin from the kitchen. Try to make do with something you have in your studio. Some of you guys got some cardboard tubes from school. These are really great because they're relatively disposable. Use them a couple times to roll out your slabs and then be done with it. The tubes I gave you are pretty rigid too, so they can take some abuse before they're worn out. I don't have one around. Those ones are my art kits from my other design classes, but I do have this piece of Schedule 40 PVC pipe from an old plumbing project that I was working on, and that's going to work just great for rolling out the slabs. Just about anything that's kind of rigid and circular that will do, and it should be wide enough that it should cover the size of the slab that you're working on. I've got a couple of other methods at school that I really like to use. One method is quite literally giant rolling pins that we have, baker's rolling pins. They're nice and large, and a nice large diameter barrel. They roll out really nicely, especially if you use two wooden strips on either side to sort of gauge the thickness of your slab as you're rolling it. That makes your slab roughly the same thickness across both sides. And then a really nice tool we have in the studio is a slab roller, which essentially uses two knurled aluminum barrels that squeezes the clay through using a large crank and some gearing. We run that through a couple layers of canvas, and it rolls out big sheets, 24 by 24 inch sheets of clay, and you can vary the thickness fairly easily. So if you happen to be at school and you want to give that thing a try, I think it's a really great way to get large slab build projects constructed. But we're not at school at the moment, we're home in our studios, so get your clay wedged and help the clay out by sort of getting it started. Kind of work it down into a disc, and don't squeeze it too much thinner than where your kind of end thickness is going to want to be. And then kind of get this in your mind that as I roll with the clay, in a moment I'm going to bring the roller over, it will stretch in the same direction as the roller that I use. So as I lay my roller down on top of the clay, this is not going to squeeze out side to side really at all. It's only going to squeeze out lengthwise. Now, I can probably do a reasonably good job here sitting down sideways and whatever, but it's probably best to stand up over this thing and kind of work it away from you and back towards you. Okay, so I'm getting close to the point where I'm actually going to lay in some guides here on the side to help me gauge thickness. Now, I just happen to have, kind of like in our studio at school, just happen to have a couple of wooden strips that I'm going to use as sort of my target thicknesses, and what I'm going to do is keep rolling that clay out until I work it down to about the thickness of my strips here. Eventually, my PVC pipe will start to ride right along the wooden strips, and it won't let me get any thinner than the wooden strips here. If you don't have anything like that, but you still want to kind of use some sort of a guide, a couple of pencils that haven't really been used very much yet probably have almost the amount of length that you need. Lay them down on either side of your piece, and then as you roll over them, it'll stop and engage on the pencils in the same way. So that worked out reasonably well. I've got my piece rolled out probably to a thickness or probably to a width on the board here that's plenty wide. I think I needed 6 inches, and I've got almost 7 inches, and then I needed 9 inches wide, enough to get those coils, and I've probably got more than what I need. So I'm just gonna grab my fettling knife. You could use your needle tool here just to slice off some of this extra clay. Nothing wrong with this clay. I'll just put it right back in a bag to use it later. And maybe do one more roll or so over the whole piece to try to smooth things out. A tool that you'll see me use in the demonstration videos for school is an old drywall mud knife. This one happens to be sort of short for this project, but I'm making a pretty small slab. And I'm just sort of running it over the surface of the clay to pull out any air bubbles or anything. I'm also adding just a little bit of pressure to the clay to sort of compress it a little bit more. Now this drywall mud knife has a very sharp corner on the end, and so it's kind of putting some tool marks into the clay. That's not a huge deal. We're going to do some work on these clay slabs that would kind of negate that. But if you really want something to put a nice smooth edge, just put these on the grinder or grab some sandpaper and rough off the corners, and it will allow you to make nice smooth transitions in the clay itself. If you don't happen to have anything quite like an old drywall mud knife, I also use sort of like thin stainless steel card. These are tools that we have in the studio at school, very similar to the smoothing rib you guys have in your kit. This one just happens to be a little bit larger, and frankly, if you happen to have an old ID or a credit card or something, that actually works beautifully for finishing the edges, because usually credit cards have these nice rounded corners which lift any tool marks and will prevent you from accidentally kind of putting tool marks back into the clay. So I've got a nice large piece of clay here. I'm not going to start working with this clay though until it reaches leather hard. And the best way to get this clay to leather hard is to let it sit overnight under plastic. I don't mean the bins though. I mean, grab a piece of the 4mm plastic sheeting that you have, and you have a lot of extra wrapped up in your clay bag. Just sort of slice a piece off the edge. Slice a piece off the edge, sort of press it lightly down into the surface of the clay, and what will happen is that overnight your canvas board will pull moisture out of the bottom of this clay slab and will dry it almost perfectly to leather hard. What I'll probably do then, just to make sure that that slab is ready for travel, is I'll put the bin on top. What we'll do tomorrow then is we will use our 3x3 inch tile and actually begin the assembly. I look forward to catching up with you guys in the studio.